right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever in the world you are tuning in from. Thanks so much for giving us a little bit of your time. As always, my name is Garrett Sammons, the host of this and many of the series that we're doing here with Light Panels. So thanks for being here. Let's go ahead and fire up the group chat. I always love seeing where everybody's tuning in here from. So I'd love to know kind of where you're coming from. This is the next installment of the Inspired by series, where I get the privilege of talking to a filmmaker about how they went about filming a particular scene or scenes in the style of a filmmaker, a show, a cinematographer, director, etc. And today is no different. Today we are looking at the work or works and style of Jordan Peele. So I see here we have some folks from New Mexico. Eric, as always, good to see you from Munich. We've got Vienna, Austria here. I'm so glad y'all are here. As always, as we are chatting through this today and discussing today, please feel free to throw your questions into the Q&A module. You can throw it in the chat too. There's a better chance I'll be able to see it in the Q&A module. And as we go through this, I will be sure to get to your questions. If I don't get to them in the moment, we'll be sure to have time at the end for that. So, okay, Los Angeles, we've got all sorts of folks in here. This is great. Before I introduce our scenes today, the first thing I would like to do is to introduce our filmmaker, a dear friend of mine and now yours. Today we are joined by Priscilla Creswell. They are an incredible filmmaker, director, and full-time producer. Cilla, it is great to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for bringing me on.
So I don't know if everybody knows this about this series, but when we do the series and I approach different filmmakers about what they want to do and how they want to do that, they come to me with the filmmaker or show or style that they want to do. So before we look at what you filmed and how you filmed it, do you want to just talk a little bit about why Jordan Peele? What was the thing that made Jordan Peele what you wanted to get after?
Well, Jordan Peele stood out to me because I actually really enjoyed the movie Nope. I know that it got um, varied reactions from everybody, but it stood out to me in the behind the scenes, the ways that they did some very creative things with cinematography and with their film and with their lighting. Uh, that came to mind just because it's pretty new, and I have a big affinity for the movie Nope for other reasons. It hits on a lot of my personal themes and interests. And on top of that, he's just the filmmaker of this generation that seems to be keeping alive the idea of using film to um, highlight aspects of society that don't get as much attention, and not just for spectacle, but that's a big part of it, but also just for love of the game and for love of storytelling. I think that the way that his visuals come into that is kind of underrated, and I haven't seen that many discussions about it, and I thought it was a really good opportunity for me to learn more about the granular aspects myself.
And one of the things that I really like about Jordan Peele is he obviously has a very storied career, right? Like he's not a filmmaker who just does one thing, right? The way
Mm.
that he approaches work as an actor is different than the work that he approaches as a producer versus a director, and he kind of has a way of being able to encapsulate what I like to call like universal truths, right? To tap into those human elements and moments, regardless of whatever the genre is that he's approaching. So before obviously we can dive into how you filmed what you filmed, we first should look at what you filmed. So today, as always, for those of you who have been a part of this for a while, we're going to be breaking down 3 different scenes that Cilla shot, then talk about how they filmed them and look at the lighting plots. We're going to look at some of the still frames, kind of break down some of the lighting, and also, as always, with the behind the scenes. So without further ado, let's go ahead and let's take a look at this first scene.
Reports are flooding in from across the country. Americans are not safe. A new terror lurks above us. Strange lights have been seen in the night sky, hovering silently, ominously. Drive a blinding glow, an unearthly radiance that chills the very soul. People are disappearing without a trace. Fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters, gone as if they were never here. Authorities remain baffled, unable to explain the strange phenomenon. But one thing is certain, we are not alone. Lock your doors, stay inside, and pray for dawn. God help us all.
What a great scene. So before I ask you kind of about the specifics and we get into it, this whole sequence, one of the things that I really like is, if you've been a viewer of this channel, you'll know this. There is a difference when it comes to lighting between natural light and available light, right? And we've talked about this before. Available light is you just show up and you shoot with whatever God's given you, where shooting with natural light is an aesthetic choice, right? We craft the lighting to look and make it look and feel normal or natural, as though it would exist that way within the space. Two very different things. And people often conflate the two as being the same, which they're not. Natural light and natural lighting takes a lot of work to get it to look and feel the way that it's supposed to, where available light works really well for things like documentary work or other things where you don't necessarily have as much control. So one of the things right off the rip that I loved about this is that it felt like you captured the aesthetic of available light, but with natural lighting in a really cool way. So talk to us a little bit about this and
out of proportion. So this bounce came in handy to do a lot of the work of redistributing that wealth of the sun right back into the walls of the barn. Other than that, we had a 1x2 or a 1x1 and a 2x1 that we had either behind our main character to provide a little bit more contrast, on the back of his head or on the front, and then also on that radio, on that close-up shot, um, you can see like otherwise it would be like a dark object on a dark background, and you would not be able to tell the difference about where one thing starts and one thing ends. So it's about that subtle contrast that came in. Um, we had a camera movement going through this, so we didn't have completely the pick of the litter in terms of where we put the lights. We had to be pretty careful. Both the opening shot where we're walking in and then some of the dolly movements, but we were able to get things just out of frame and pretty well contrasted overall.
okay, cool. So that's a lot to break down here. I really like how thoroughly you thought this through, which is wonderful. So a couple of things of note in this is that even though you're using the sun as your key light kind of source, right? And we're going to look at some of the still frames here in a bit. One of the things that I really like about this is the way that you've set up this lighting, right? So obviously key light here is the sun. That's what's giving us our main source of light. But this bounce is doing a huge amount of lift in terms of keeping that contrast in kind of a way that we can capture on camera. The other thing that I think is important to note that you've done a good job here that I think that filmmakers could really use and take to heart is the way that you set up lights needs to, for as much as possible, adhere to your 180-degree rule, right? Which is going to give you the freedom and flexibility to actually shoot within the scene without having to do a ton of setups, right? So by breaking up this line here, right, and filming on one side of your 180-degree, right, you're able to eclipse all of what's happening back here, not really see all of that, but get all of the effects of it. When it comes to efficiency on a film set, right, that's the thing that is of most importance to a producer, is how quickly can we get this stuff done. We want to minimize setups, right? This is why we talk about lighting spaces and not faces, right? We want to make sure that we're doing as good a job as we can getting the light set up in a way that gives us that freedom of movement, so we're not having to constantly break down, change over, set up, right? So excellent work there. Okay, hold on here. I'm hearing that the microphone is a little low. Hold on. Wait for it. There we go. Hold on. Let's go here. All right. I will adjust this here in just a second. So while I get going on that, let's go ahead and break down scene number 2. If you do have questions, by the way, between all of these, please feel free to throw those in the Q&A. That way we'll be able to answer those questions. So let's dive into the second of our 2 scenes now. Okay. Wow. Hopefully that's a little louder for everybody. It should be. I boosted it just a little bit there. But let's go ahead and let's break down this second scene, which is awesome. Cilla, how did you do it?
That went into this. This is where we were getting some inspiration from the hallway scene from Us. While this is mostly a piece that takes inspiration from Nope, I wanted to have little sprinkles of other movies that Jordan Peele did, just to keep things fun and give some more inspiration. That hallway shot has these visible ceiling lights that help give a sense of depth as you're going down it, as you're traveling through it. And this stable has evenly spaced practical tungsten bare bulbs all the way down it. And so every other piece of lighting was integrated in order to help accent and also offset these practicals. That came in the form of some tungsten 1x1s that were in the stalls. As we moved through it, we had to readjust many of the stalls we had horses in, so we didn't keep the lights in next to all the horses, obviously. That would be a nightmare. And then the other big piece of lighting that came in was this 2x1 set to 10,000. While everything else was tungsten, this one went super, super cold. That's on the outside of the barn. That one was manually swung around to create the exterior ship light passing effect. And the main goal with this one was to have a lot of different contrast in color and to sort of bridge this warm daylight first scene and then the last scene, which is mostly cold. So when you see them all together, you see that there's a bit of a gradient. So this had a bit of a 50-50 mix of color temperature, which was fun.
So the other thing I want to talk about a little bit is the lighting effect, right, of the light kind of passing through the slats above the barn, and we kind of saw a little bit of it in the BTS in terms of like how you were able to get that light, right, with some of them being battery powered and all of that. I've got a little setup here. Walk me through how we did this on camera lighting effect.
So this is where having plenty of crew goes in handy. This is a two floor barn. Actually, the first scene is the first floor, and the stables are right underneath. So there is a old barnwood slat floor that runs right over top of the stables, and it's got those cracks. It's got the holes. Now there were 4 lights that were manned that all were running off of battery power. We had the Anton Bowers hooked up to these. There's 2 2x1s and there's 2 1x1s. And we had 4 people holding them by hand and then on cue running the length of the barn. That's what gives that movement. There isn't a different way that I would do this to keep them on stands. I think it just took some creative thinking with this one, but actually holding them by hand and running them across, they got their workout in for sure.
The other thing, so with that, right? Did we pipe in any atmosphere or haze or anything to catch the light, or did we just use the elements as they were in the barn?
Well, as much as there was a horse at the end of the stall that actually was farting nonstop through this, you would think that that would create like enough atmosphere on its own. But actually, yes, we did pipe in some extra atmosphere, and we were pretty careful with it. Again, because we're dealing with live horses, and they didn't like it that much. So it was very, very carefully applied and mostly applied just to that top to get some of those beams.
Love it. Love it. Quick question we've got here from Jonathan. Hi, can you share what color temperature the camera was set to for this scene? Because we've talked about what we've set the lights to, but what was the camera set at?
So we had, because I knew that this is a scene that's mostly based around demonstrating color contrast, we had the tungsten lights and we had the cold lights. So we were set somewhere around not quite daylight, but we were skewing towards that warm end a little bit, but allowing both of them to have biased color in the image, if that answers that.
Yeah, I think that's right, and that's usually a pretty good approach anytime you're talking about mixed color lighting, right? When we're mixing warm and cool, you kind of want to middle it somewhere so that way you can kind of get the effects of both without any one of them being a little too exaggerated. Okay, cool. I have another question here. What was the most difficult thing about achieving the look that you wanted?
Probably the most difficult part was just the fact that everything was on a pretty tight turnaround. From like project start, but also like we had about 5 hours we were shooting all of this in. So it was definitely a game of careful management of time and personnel. That being said, all the prep work that went into this ahead of time, my lovely producer, who is also my partner, also did a ton of legwork to get everybody on the same page. And so when everybody showed up, there were very few questions. We already had done a walkthrough, but it was mostly that time constraint and the fact that it's a working barn, and so there's a mess everywhere. So making sure that there's protocols in place, that people are clean and equipment stays clean. Um, that I think was the most difficult part.
Well, and like, you definitely want to make sure that you're being respectful to the animals that are there as well.
Yeah, we had handlers who knew the horses. We were checking in and asking questions, especially when it came to things like the haze and intentionally pestering a horse with a light in its face. Um, the horse actually does react like that to like whinny and like snuffle and like move away. So it was definitely checking in regularly, making sure we're good with everything that we're doing.
Yeah, what's the phrase that's always used? The three hardest things in filmmaking are period pieces, working with children, and working with animals. So at least you only did one of the three. Before we
Oh,
move on,
we had a young lad on our
oh, that is
set.
true. You did, yeah, yeah. So two of the three. So before we move on, I want to kind of look at kind of what the effect of this lighting, right? So you can kind of see up here in the top, you get a little bit of haze. You're getting a little bit of kind of natural bloom off of this kind of these background overhead lights. When you're shooting digital, for those who don't know, one of the biggest differences aesthetically is the way that your color comes across and then the way that your highlight roll off happens. And so in digital, we have to kind of play with it a little bit to make it look a little bit more like film. And so having some haze here, and I don't know if you threw any sort of diff on the lens, but you have a really nice roll off of that practical that you have here. But again, you can kind of see some of that haze up there. One of the things that really struck me about the way that this looks, and this just goes into the value of mixed color lighting, right, is if we zoom in here on the face, right? So here we have harsh, direct lighting, so behaviorally hard light, directional from above, because of course we have the light coming through the slats. But we do such a good job here of the way that you have him blocked. So we're getting this really nice blue on that front shoulder. We're getting really good catch lights in the eyes, right? And we're able to see our character clearly while using the practical that's right behind the head here in a way that kind of separates them off of the background. So really, really cool approach to how you think about lighting, but then of course the execution itself is really, really, really well executed. So good work on that one. If there's no more questions on this one, we'll go ahead and we'll move on to our third scene here. So this is the third of the three scenes. One of the things I really love about this scene is it kind of combines elements of Get Out, Us, and Nope kind of all in one sequence. So very, very cool there. Now, one of the things that I know they did a lot of in Nope is they did a lot of day for night, right? And I know that that's not how this was shot. This was actually shot at night. One of the episodes that we've shot in, or that we've live streamed in the past, and if you haven't yet seen it, go subscribe to Light Panel's YouTube channel and you can see all of our past live streams over there. One of the things that we talked about in that live stream was confidently underexposing and the value of when you understand how to set your exposure to your camera, you can get really, really cool images. So walk us through a little bit of how you went about shooting this scene.
blue moonlight onto our character for that first part of the scene. When we have some radiant light happening on the sky, then we feel that that moonlight is properly motivated. We can more easily believe the blue that's coming onto their character. So we had a big, soft, I think it was also at 10K moonlight that was shooting down at our character. It was pretty stepped off so that as he walks in, it looks like it's covering um, his whole movement without lighting up the back. And then in the back of the scene on the barn, we had a 1 by 1 in all of the windows of the barn. Not every window had glass in it, so we hung wax paper to diffuse all of it. And this is where we get a lot of the inspiration for the framing that was in Nope. So there's a really beautiful shot where Daniel Kaluuya's character is standing in front of the barn with his horse in the moonlight, and you see this warm light coming from the house in the background and this cold light in the moonlight. And I thought that was really great contrast, and we were able to replicate that pretty well. And we had a motivated tungsten light just behind our character too, to help push a little bit more of that contrast, and to make it look like our light is traveling that far. And then we had a big 2 by 1 hard that was shining pretty much right above him that came on cue, and that was the practical ship light, him being abducted. So I really like the setup for this one, just because having those practicals in the barn windows was a lot of fun. But the part that I think was everybody's favorite was getting scaffolding set up on in the middle of this field. That setup was happening actually while we were doing the first one. That's how we kind of organized the time. A large piece of scaffolding was built up. It was tested. Our crew member Matt can be seen in that BTS footage. Just taking his life into his own hands, swinging around in it, just for the good of the shoot, not just because he wants to hang in a harness, for sure. But we made um, in that setup, just because it was a little demanding. So a 2 by 1 up on the top of that scaffolding. We have a leaf blower being manned off to the side to create movement in his shirt. I think that that's a piece of texture that was in Get Out, where his shirt was blowing in this vacuum of space, and gave you a real sense that he wasn't just dangling in some like psych empty room. And then yes, he's getting winched up. So that was actually a really simple setup in terms of lighting. We only had one giant light shooting straight down, but those 2 by 1s can get super bright. So it was all we needed. But the most complicated part was just making sure everybody was set up safely, and we could cover him in such a way where we could mask out any of the scaffolding and the harness.
So one of the things that I think you did a really good job of, and I'd like to kind of talk a little bit more about it, is that we quite seamlessly blended half of a scene which is shot in twilight, right, or just after golden hour, and then another half of the scene which is shot much after dark. And in the final project, you can't really tell a difference between them. Is that white balance and exposure adjustment in camera? Is that compensating for it in how we have the lights rigged and set up? How do you achieve two different lighting setups and time of day into a single scene?
So I think a lot of the way that these two blend is benefited by the fact that we have a motivated change in lighting that is part of the action of the scene. So if you think about like how we would experience a bright light shining right in our faces, suddenly everything else does fall away. And we eventually adjust, and then we can see like our environment for how it is in this new lighting setup. So as that scene sort of progresses, we get a little bit of the experience of like our eyes adjusting to this big bright new light, and everything else falls away. I think too that that's aided by the other side of that same coin, which is that when we're out at night, especially in the countryside where it's like genuinely very dark, we don't have that much light leak happening in the sky. We adjust and we do see the sky is kind of blue. We can still see relief of the tree line against the sky. So when we see that in movies, we expect there to be a suspension of disbelief, and also recreating something that cameras can't capture that easily, which is how we really experience an environment. As people, as eyes that are better than cameras, I was going to say are probably ever going to get, but I don't really know at this rate. Probably we will get some cameras that are better than our eyeballs.
1,000%. Okay, cool. I want to look at one of these shots here real quick because you brought something up that I think is really important to talk about, and that is motivated light. We've talked about it in this series before and series that we've done in the past, but it's worth kind of re-examining and taking a look at. Motivated light is where you take a light that is within your scene, something that we would consider to be a practical, right? Whether we've brought it in set deck or not. And then we have an off-camera light or a studio light that we use to get that light to behave the way that we want it to, right? So in this sequence here, right, we have all of these lights in the barn kind of shining through the windows to give us this sense of kind of this warm light that's coming from the barn onto our character. Now, that barn, I understand this lighting plot, not exactly to scale in terms of distance here, but that light that's coming is warm light, where the rest of this light that we're playing with over here is going to be much cooler light comparatively. So because of the distance between our subject and the barn, these lights, while a nice background element, aren't actually touching our subject. They're not reaching them in a meaningful way, which is where this light then comes into play, where we then bring a light in off camera, have it behave the way that we want it to on camera, and treat it as a motivated light. And let me show you kind of that in one of these still frames here. So if we come here, you can see we have the barn. Here's the lights in the background there. They're shining through those windows. That's that warm light. And if I zoom in on my character here, right, and we're looking at my subject, we have the cool light coming in here from the night sky, and then obviously the light that's coming in from the beam of the ship. But this right here, off of this side of our character, this is the motivated light. Okay, so you can see here as I zoom in, we have this wrap that's coming around the ear, that's coming behind the shoulder, that's introducing that warm light element to our subject, right? So these lights over here, we assume are what's giving us kind of this warm backlight to our subject, even though these lights have nothing to do with that. So I wanted to point that out because it's a very, very good execution of motivated light. And it's something that I think that filmmakers really should think through in terms of, you don't actually need to put giant bright lights in those windows to reach your subject, get those lights to look the way you want them to look, and then bring in a motivated light to then get that light to behave in your foreground the way that you want it to. So I think you absolutely crushed that there. Let's talk a little bit about the winch, because the winch and the lift and all of that is super cool. And there's a lot of ways that you can do that. And I've seen various tutorials online of different approaches that people will do, where they'll like split somebody in half, right? And they'll use apple boxes, pick them up, get the below the belt, and then have like an upper, and then composite it, and it gets really, really nuts. Your solution is quite simple, but quite effective, right? If any of you are going to attempt this, there's a couple of things to note from a safety concern. Number one, please make sure you actually use real scaffolding, right? Don't concoct something together with C-stands. That's horrifying and dangerous, right? Make sure that we're keeping our talent and crew safety at the top. The piece in this that I really want to talk about is kind of twofold. One, we obviously have our subject harnessed, right? That's one piece. How do you go about hiding the harness? How do you go about compositing out the harness? Like, how does the harness play into the final look of the image?
Okay, I think that's a good question. So, like you said, there's a lot of ways that you can accomplish this like person floating in space. When we were going into this set, um, this is also located at the Hollywood farmstead in, oh my gosh, is it Milan?
Yeah, I think it's Marlin.
Yeah, they have a great barn. That's the barn that we shot in. Half of that barn is a ginormous green cyc. Like, we could have suspended our character somewhere in that cyc or put him on a big green box and sort of like asked him to go on his tippy toes. We played with a few options before we landed on scaffolding and suspending a person in real nighttime negative space. This is where having the benefit of the studio owner, who is really imaginative and really does care about everyone's safety. He had this scaffolding and he had a feeling that this would be the best way to do it. We've got that winch, we've got that harness. They have suspended people in different ways on their working property before. They were able to suspend someone in a scene where they're like floating into a tree, I believe, but they used the tree to help move that person up. Now, since we wanted full negative space, this is where Joe said, okay, we've got this scaffolding. We can rig it safely and stably in such a way where we have a clear pass through through it. He knows how to use scaffolding. He's built it a bunch of times. That is why we trusted him. We would not have done this if this was our first time all contributing to a scaffolding winch harness situation. So we're really glad that he was able to show us the ropes, so to speak, and make sure safety was first and foremost. So this was chosen because it made the most sense for compositing out. Now, if we were to shoot this on a big green cyc, we might have to deal with a lot of color spill, and the harness itself, which is black, would have way more contrast. We would also just be dealing with having to shape our light a lot more carefully. This gave us a huge benefit in that the light could just fill our character, and just because of the directionality, even though we've got the light straight down on that rope, it had pretty minimal glare. We Joe even went over it with a flat black spray paint beforehand to help reduce some of the glare. But because it is dark and because we're dealing with a lot of high contrast directional shadow, the majority of the harness falls away into shadow. Then it becomes so I'm not I'm not as good at After Effects as I wish that I was, and I've got people who I tend to go to when I've got a really complex After Effects process. Um, we had a really short time frame to turn this out. So what this became was a really funny game of lots of keyframing masks. The majority of the masks were just that harness rope that's suspended in air. We had a couple places where it was crossing in front of the shirt, and that was just cloning and masking the shirt. But it was pretty minimal because we've got this high contrast light. You can't see his butt, so like you can't see that the harness is wrapping around him. And then the other part was also just doing a cheeky little one button on his shirt to keep it pretty closed right here, which is the harness was wrapping around the back and kind of holding him from the front, so we had like a V here, and the button right there helped cover it on the shirt for the shots that really mattered, and then everything else could just be masked away after that shirt. So this was definitely selected because it just helps to make that effect easier to sell in general.
And then does blocking play a role in this, right? So like if we look at kind of like this still frame here, right? Like we're kind of behind our subject. So we're not looking at kind of the front. Is that, is the arm placement, is the way that we have him blocked within the frame, does all of that kind of play into the consideration of how we have this set up?
Definitely. We also have a close-up that's later in the scene, and that one he was out of the harness already. We were able to get some of his like mid chest and up, so we could sell the effect of this dude's totally not harnessed in and hanging in the sky. We can see his shirt, and when that's all mixed in, it just helps to sell the effect. So blocking for sure was pretty carefully done. We wanted to shoot primarily profile and behind. Part of the difficulty was that the combination of all factors, he really wanted to spin. So this was also shot in 120 because that also helps with the kind of ethereal effect of his clothes moving. We could get every little inch of where he was positioned accurately. Because it's 120, we just have like that multiplied how long that is on that timeline. So yeah.
I love it.
Did I answer it?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple of questions have come in here. One question, before the subject is abducted, he was looking at the night sky. Did you use only one light on the camera side to light him? Also, what kind of diffusion do you use to keep the light so soft? So I'll pull up that frame here. So for the night sky here, when we're talking about how we have him lit, how do you have him lit and why?
So yeah, do you have the lighting plot there?
Let's
So
see.
we actually do have only one light that is playing the role of the moonlight, and then one light that's again on the reverse that's playing the role of the contrast of the motivated tungsten light from the barn. The one light though that is playing the moonlight is a 2x1 that is diffused and then also has like an egg crate on it to help keep things relatively directional. We don't get a ton of spill across the grass, and that is set to that cool temperature. That's what helps sell that soft moonlight. It's a soft light. We didn't have it up all the way in terms of brightness. Since we were at twilight, we didn't have to do as much as we would have otherwise to give the camera enough light and information. There's a second light that's in front of him, and that's the light that's playing the role of the ship beam that turns on. So this isn't one light that just turns brighter. This is the moonlight that's staying static, and then the ship beam effect light, which is another 2x1, but a hard. That one is one that's super lofted above him, on pretty much the same side that the moonlight is, though.
Got it. So real quick here, for the light that's playing our moonlight here, we got the 2x1 soft that's kind of giving us that. In terms of behavior, you mentioned an egg crate to control the spill, right? Because the nice thing with egg crates is that they don't change the light's behavior; they just change the directionality of that light, right, to keep it kind of a little bit more focused. Did you have any additional diffusion on the 2x1 soft, or did you just let the 2x1 soft be as it was?
That's just the 2x1 soft being as diffused as it comes. We didn't have to have the light up that high, so it's not like we were trying to avoid knocking it down, in in terms of brightness. Um, we just didn't need to get it that much softer. It had a really gentle touch already.
I love it. I love it. All right. Another question we've got here is when approaching an interior lighting setup, which light do you go with first? I kind of want to use this one as the example for this just because I'm absolutely in love with how you were able to make this look. So, when setting up a lighting setup like this for you in your process, which light do you start with and then how do you back off from there?
Okay, well, for interiors, I mean, I would say that the first light for me is usually what makes sense in the scene to be motivated. It seems like the kind of the name of the game for this live stream, but what is like the light that is contributing to the story? So for that shot that you have, obviously he's looking into quite this bright, sunlit, sun-soaked field. So the sun is playing the most in terms of the story. The sun was the most important part to make sure that it is um, he's angled in the sun in a way we're shooting into it in a way where we're shooting into shadow here. We can get that lovely contrast. So what is in your scene in interiors that is contributing to the story? And then after that, it's mostly a game of how can you one give enough information to the camera, so do you need to supplement, how do you need to supplement, and then two, the game of contrast, and is that contrast coming in the form of pulling the character in terms of relief off of the background. So this shot here, the we had a light that was acting as a little bit of a rim because otherwise he would fall into this very, very dark barn if he didn't have some help. Um, or is the texture also coming from color? So like the stalls or the stables interior scene, we've got tungsten and we've got like this blue light that's coming from the outside. Um, Contrast can come in a lot of ways, but I think that it comes first, what is narratively motivated in the scene? And then two, how can you contrast that?
I think that that's absolutely right. So, like, if we look at this scene as an example, right? So, obviously, if we're starting with sources and practicals and then kind of working our way backwards off of that, right? We see that the hottest point in the frame is here. This is what's coming from the sun, right? And that's what's acting as the key on our subject here, right? We also catch this like really beautiful catch light in both eyes, which works really, really well. Let's talk a little bit about kind of this hair light, backlight, cut light that we're kind of catching along here, right? Because that wouldn't normally be in that space on its own. Is that large bounce that we're playing with, or is that the 2x1 and the 1x1 that are kind of shaping that around? Like, how are we getting this really sweet separation off of our background?
So that was a 1x1. And these two ended up playing well with each other because we also had a giant sheet of diffusion actually helping to soften the sunlight when we had that reverse shot of his face. Since we know that the sun was motivating, we're in this close up. We have the opportunity to create to like add more elements to the scene that we don't have to like avoid seeing like the camera seeing. So the diffusion was just on the other side of the camera, wrapping around him, helping to balance that light, and then the 1x1 hard was scooted to hang just over his shoulder. And it also had an egg crate on it to help with the directionality so it didn't go too far and start spilling into that's fun. Start spilling into the edge of the camera. creating any unnecessary flares. It kept it super controlled.
So this is one of the things that I love to talk about when we're talking about exteriors, and we're running out of time here, but I kind of wanted to touch on it a little bit. When we talk about super wide shots, when we're shooting in daylight, right? Generally speaking, we're letting the sun behave as it naturally would, because we wouldn't usually have enough cloud or diff that we could fly over to make that make sense. But then when you cut into the medium close-up shots like that, they often look like this, which is going to be a much more diffused, much more kind of beautiful roll-off on the skin tone, because that's really where people look their best. And nobody in the audience really ever questions it. If you're watching this live stream or the record afterwards, congratulations, movies are going to be ruined for you forever. But most people never think about that. Most people don't go be like, wait, hold on, the light was hard in the wide shot, why is it soft and diffused in this shot? And that comes down to, like, we're not here to create or recreate reality. We're here to create a new reality, right? We're creating a world in which our audience can live and breathe and have that floating eyeball syndrome, where they stop existing in the theater or at their computer where they're watching the thing, and they just kind of become a part of the story. So I think that you absolutely nailed this here. All right, chat, let's give a big round of applause to Cilla. Thank you so much for being a part of this. It's a pleasure, as always, to get to work with you, and you did an absolutely incredible job. Cilla, is there a place online people can find you should they want to follow you online?
Oh gosh. Okay. Well, I am on Instagram at Cillavision. I'm very rarely on it, so if you want to hang out and visit me there, you're more than welcome to. I'm technically on YouTube under that same handle as well, Cillavision. But I would also say that the crew that went into this one is also part of what made that magic. So I don't know if it's appropriate for me to call out everybody who was there if you want.
We're going to play the playoff music.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. That's good.
This is the end of the speech where it's just like, and I'd also like to thank my mother.
Yes, right, exactly. And this is where the orchestra comes in. But all right, chat, let's give Cilla a round of applause here. Again, our next live stream is going to be November 19th. Make sure that you go online and you register for that. As always, all of these are free. If you do attend the live stream, you'll be able to get some of the more interactive components, like asking questions and getting involved there. Make sure you subscribe to Light Panels on YouTube, as well as to my YouTube channel, which is just youtube.com/Garrett Sammons. You can also follow me on Instagram at that same handle. I love interacting and chatting with you all and answering questions that you might have that didn't make it into the stream. Make sure you follow Cilla, follow myself, follow Light Panels. It's a blast doing these. We've got one more this year, so you're not going to want to miss it on November 19th. Register for free on there. Thanks to Light Panels, as always, for hosting these. I absolutely have a ball doing this, and I look forward to seeing you all next time. Thanks.